Hey, it's Jeremy from jeremy.net. I am a comic book artist, writer, self publisher, and I share my creative process here with you live on the internet. If you'd like to support this channel, get additional bonus live stream videos once a month, get all access behind the scenes to all of the projects I'm working on, additional blog posts and creative sketches, you can support this channel at patreon.com/GERIMI. That's patreon.com/GERIMI. If you would like to get a look at some of the comic books that I'm creating, I'm running the current series I'm doing, Morning Star, as a webcomic on my newsletter page. You can go to news.jeremy.net and you can read the archives there, or sign up and get the pages delivered straight to your email inbox. And if you would like to purchase physical copies of my comics, you can go to amazon.jeremy.net. That will take you to my Patreon, to my Amazon author page. You can pick up copies of the first volume of Morning Star, Welcome to Heaven, has issues 1 through 4 in it. You can also pick up my previous graphic novel, Eye of the Gods, which is a psychological thriller. And yeah, that's it. Let's get started. I see Mark's already in the chat. He's first one in. Good to see you. Amara says she's out of her cast. Her doctor suggested knitting to build up muscle in the right hand. Had an injury a while back. I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm glad you're out of the cast. And you know, some knitting sounds like it'd be nice and therapeutic and relaxing. So, what we've got going on here today, we have some more correcting some bad figure drawings. As I've mentioned in the past, figure drawing has been vital to me improving my draftsmanship, my sense of volume and lighting and storytelling. It's essential to my comic book creation. Figure drawing is helping me become a better artist, and becoming a better visual artist is helping me become better at making comics. Now, a quick update before we dive in. The reason, whoops, hit the camera there as I'm sliding into position. The reason for more figure drawing is because on the comic book side, I've shown you in last week's video that I've been working on on doing a digital painting for the cover, and I'm using a new software, Affinity Photo. Along with that, I am also using Affinity Designer, which is sort of the company's version of Adobe Illustrator. I'm using that for doing the lettering. And as many of you have used Illustrator know, there's a bit of a learning curve to Illustrator. There's also a bit of a learning curve to this new program, Affinity Designer. So instead of having you watch me fumble through lettering, I decided let's do a little bit more figure drawing this week, and then hopefully next week I will be farther along in terms of knowing the program well enough to show you a little bit of the lettering process, or maybe we'll just go back and forth between the lettering and digital painting of the cover. So I'm still moving forward with working on Morning Star, the final issue, but it's just taking a little bit of time to learn and bone up on the tools that I'm going to be using. So, let's see here. Let me flip through. All right. So I've got a stack of some figure drawings here, and I saved some drawings from class that don't necessarily come out well, or I see things that I want to improve, mistakes that I've made here and there. And I save them specifically so I can redraw, do sketches analyzing the mistakes that I've made. And I'm trying to decide between these two drawings because this one has some challenging foreshortening in it, but this one just has a very wonky rib cage in terms of the shoulder, the arms, what they're doing, the way that the breasts sit on the rib cage. It's all just sort of off and bent out of shape. I think that this one bothers me more, so I think I want to work on this one more. So, let's see here. Let's bring the camera into position a little bit more. fact, I need to angle this a little bit more so you can see the bottom of the page that I'm drawing on. And I actually need to change the position of my iPad so I can see the chat better while this is going on. Let's see here. Interesting. I made the fatal flaw of turning my iPad while I was doing this, and now the chat seems to have vanished, so I just need to figure out how to bring it back. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and get started here. So, oh, I see, I just need to hit live chat. Sometimes the technology works seamlessly. Sometimes you've got to monkey with it for a while. All right, well, I'll mess with that later. Let's get started, and if I miss any comments, I will try to come back to them and take a look later. So, starting out here, I guess the main thing is I'm looking at this drawing, and I kind of want to go back to my old standby, which I've mentioned before, which is starting, if I've got a drawing that really feels like it's off the rails, to start by looking at sort of the skeletal structure of the figure. So I'm starting with just a really gestural stick figure, getting the curve of the hips, one leg coming out and crossing over the other. I probably should bring this up a little bit higher. Knee coming down. Elbow is almost even with the break in the hips to the upper torso. Shoulder coming up. And the other arm is pressed sort of back. And you kind of have to see through. The idea of drawing through the figure is almost treating it like you're looking at something that's made out of glass and being able to x-ray through. So really this arm, the shoulders up a little bit, arms coming back, then the hand coming out, the forearm coming out forward. And I didn't really get the angle that the wrist is at, but I'm just going to presume that's sort of dropping off the back of the chair the model was resting on. And then sort of crowning this with a very simple sphere and egg kind of resting on the top. So this is just a really simple gesture drawing. Just getting the head and torso, and then the direction that the arms and legs are moving in. And then from here, normally I would start with blocking out simple volumes, tubes, cylinders, spheres, what have you. But in this case, I'm going to start trying to block out actual skeletal forms, the rib cage separate from the hips. I'm going to basically very lightly try to draw the skeleton into this figure, and then from there, perhaps I'll fill in the actual muscles and flesh and bone on top, or I may just do a second drawing that goes for the volumetric once I do a little bit of analysis based on this. So let's see. Mark asks, Jeremy, where did you learn your perspective? I think my lack of perspective is hurting my figure drawing. Well, yeah, I've had the same problem in the sense that I noticed after taking many years of figure drawing classes, I started developing But what I started noticing is that my basic primitive forms, if I just draw a cylinder for an arm or a leg, or I'm trying to draw the rib cage, let's say that I'm just drawing a very simple, instead of a cylinder, let's do a cube or a rectangular block, only because with a block you can kind of see when edges aren't lining up. So, you know what? I'll be a little bit looser and lighter with this. I'm intentionally tweaking this. And when I'm tweaking this, I'll show you what I mean. So, this is a block, right? But notice how this line is not parallel with that line. Notice that this line is also not parallel with this line. Notice that this longitudinal line is not parallel to this one. They're kind of tweaked and they're off. And I started noticing that if these primitive lines are wonky, it's one thing if you're intentionally doing it to imply that a form is twisting. Like for instance, the way that the wrist will turn over so that you have the sense of, it feels like it's a sphere with a block coming out of it, but what's really happening is that the bones are turning, so it's almost like you have a block that is twisting, like the contrapposto of a figure twisting their torso. It's one thing to have one side intentionally twisting like this, so that what was the side becomes the top. It's another thing to just have primitive forms that are wonky and out of proportion. So I actually took a class with one of the instructors at the Animation Guild, John Messer. He teaches perspective. He's a great instructor, and I've still not taken his basic perspective class, and I want to at some point because I feel like you can never have enough of those fundamentals, whether it's basic gesture drawing, perspective, primitive volumes and basic anatomy, all of those things. It's not like you just learn them once and you master them. It's always good to revisit them to see what you think and know about these concepts. The class that I took with John Messer was actually a class on environmental drawing, but he goes over a lot of his perspective fundamentals during that class. Now, for those of you who don't have a place where you can take figure drawing classes easily nearby and, and really get a lot out of them, I will tell you that there's a couple of books that I have on perspective that have been useful to me. One is, let's see. This one is called Perspective for Comic Book Artists by David Chelsea. And I will actually put a link in the description for this after the video. They'll take you to my my Amazon affiliate page. So I get a little bonus if you order through that link. It doesn't cost anything more for you, but just I recommend a lot of books on this YouTube channel. So I figure why not get a little something for it? But anyway, this book I found is very useful, and it's written similarly to Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. So it's a perspective book that is told as a comic. So you're sort of like walking through the journey of this character who's being taught perspective by the author of the book. And it's very simple, straightforward, visual storytelling. Mark says that your library is awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, for me, it's just other people have recommended great books to me, and I try to pass that on to you guys, you viewers as well, because that's how you learn. Other people learn something and then pass it on to you. You pass it on to others. Now, I'm going to step away from the table for a second because the other book that I want to recommend is not in this room. I have a larger library, so I need to step away for just a second and grab that book. And we're back. So the other book, so this is a book that I'd had for a while now, and this was probably the main book that I looked at I've looked at other perspective books before and they were kind of dry and not interesting. This was the first perspective book I felt like I really locked into and really learned a lot of the fundamentals from in terms of understanding how I was building pictures building perspective within the picture plane of comic book panels. The other book is Perspective Made Easy by Ernest Norling. And this book is a very straightforward, simple book with simple diagrams and exercises that you can try out, experiment with yourself. I mean, it's all built around simple blocks and spheres and building them into forms, internal shapes, external shapes. It's showing you how to, place figures within structures. And figures are very, very important in the sense that they give a building, it gives you the relationship, the visual relationship. It gives you scale by putting a figure in an environment. Because what makes you tell the difference between this being a building versus a shoebox? It's because you can see a human being standing next to it. So this whole book has tons of very useful, simple diagrams and exercises. And I wanted to mention this one because I also mentioned my the instructor, John Messer. This was one of the books that he recommended that we all get for his class. He didn't demand it, but he said this book really gives you a solid foundation on it. So I'll put links after the live stream is over. I'll put links to both of these in the description of the video. But John had some great recommendations. There's actually another book. I'll put that in the chat as well that I haven't had a chance to open yet. But all of my books on perspective, I think I will put in there. And you know what? As a bonus, I'll tell you this, one more thing. I haven't started reading them yet, but I am a big fan of Mateu-Mestre's Framed Ink book. And so for a long time, he's had Framed Perspective 1 and Framed Perspective 2. So these are books that I have bought, but I have not actually started reviewing them yet. But they're books that I very much wanted to, I learned so much from his Framed Ink book that I thought I really need to get these and study them. So these are also on my to-study list, but I figured, I'll toss those out there as well. So the fact that I've got like 5 books on perspective just laying around, and these are the 5 most useful books. In fact, maybe I'll make a Patreon exclusive where I'll just flip through them and I'll say my top 5 exclusive. But you guys will at least get the list of them before, after the video's over. So yes, those are some good books. But for me, really learning perspective, I learned a lot specifically by being in class and having someone correct my drawings, showing me different errors and things that I could work on. Ask Luber says yes. So I'm glad he's I think that's just referring to the recommendations in general. So hang on, let me see if I can turn the chat back on my my tablet real quick. Let's see here. Okay, that's all. I just had to refresh. So Mark also asks, is the second book like a Bridgman book for perspective? Well, I will tell you this. I think that the second book, the Perspective Made Easy, I would say that book is actually easier to understand than Bridgman, because Bridgman can be a little bit complicated and difficult to understand if you're not used to, Bridgman is one of those artists where you kind of already need to know how to draw a little bit in order to really get a lot out of it. So, and I feel like this perspective book is probably easier to understand than Bridgman. So it's, you know what it is? It's Loomis. It's Loomis for perspective, which Andrew Loomis also does touch on perspective in Figure Drawing for All It's Worth. So it is worth checking out in that book as well, because perspective definitely perspective affects everything you draw. So it's not just anatomy, it's anatomy, environments, composition, everything that's within the picture. If you're doing somewhat representational artwork, perspective affects it to some degree or another. Even if you're doing an isometric, Yeah, an isometric drawing that has sort of a flattened X, Y, and Z axis. You're not getting any actual proportion or camera perspective to it. Even in those circumstances, that's a conscious choice that you're sticking to, and it's kind of a fictional type of perspective. So what I'm starting to do here is I'm just trying to block in the basics of what the rib cage is doing. So the body is already kind of twisting down and away. And what's happening is, let me do another little diagram here on this side. And the idea of all of this is that I look at the existing drawing that's not going well, and I look at what are the things that I missed and didn't get right. But in order to do that, I kind of have to look at what was originally put down in the drawing. What was I trying to do? So we've got an upper body that is mostly upright. Then there's the space between the rib cage and the pelvis that's sort of twisting, coming towards us. And then you've got the rib cage coming, you've got the pelvis sitting, it's still tilted. In fact, I think one of the mistakes, looking at this drawing, I feel like I should have pushed the center line more away from the viewer and maybe enhance that twist so that the hips are turned a little bit more facing us as viewers. So this diagram I just drew here doesn't really capture it, but let's say that I do this with simple boxes. And the reason for simple boxes is just because it's much easier to emphasize a front, back, and side. So let's say that here's the pelvis, this is the side of it, here's the rib cage, and I'm gonna just shade more of the side, and I'm gonna make the front plane narrower. So that's to kind of indicate the fact that this is more turned away from us. And then you've just got that nice sort of serpentine twist that's happening in the rib cage. I mean below the rib cage. It's happening in the midsection, in the middle of the abdomen. So this twist is the main thing that I feel like I'm missing. And then this shoulder looks awkward, almost like it's broken. And I think a lot of that is because I'm not getting as much of, what's happening is the elbow is resting on the arm of a chair and it's pushing that elbow up. And I don't think that I really conveyed that well. So looking at this purely in terms of a skeleton, I'm sort of jumping around the figure a lot more than I really usually do. I think that's because as I'm drawing, I'm narrating what I'm thinking about. And this is what's happening inside my head, you know, when I'm sitting in front of the model. I'm constantly looking around saying, well, this needs to be adjusted, this is too high, this is too low. So let's say that the rib cage, not the rib cage, the pelvis is just simply rounded out there. Let me just put a little darker mark in there to kind of really solidify the location of the bottom of the rib cage. And there's a little bit of a dip because we've got this rib cage protruding out here. And then you've got the soft flesh in between the middle of the torso that's coming down and then stretching. In fact, there probably should be a little bit of compression that I also did not capture. That's the nice thing about going back and analyzing these is I can look at them and say, what did I miss when I was originally drawing it? And the same way that you're getting a little bit of a stretch on the left side of the figure on this side, there should be a little bit of compression on the right side of the figure. Now, in real life, at the time the model was posing, it may not have been a particularly exaggerated twist. It may not have been an exaggerated level of compression, like as if you're doing like squash and stretch in animation. But sometimes enhancing those things makes you feel what the figure felt like a little bit more, even if visually it wasn't quite that dramatic. So let's say that going down here, that this is where the head of the femur is. Because I'm trying to come back and also remember, I'm trying to look at this on a skeletal level before really adding a lot of flesh on there. When it's an interesting thing with the rib cage, because the rib cage is a volume, but it's also, you know, it's bone. So I'm trying to respect the idea of laying out a framework, a scaffolding, to lay the muscles that would be there, to lay those those muscles on top of. But I'm also trying to think of the overall basic volumes that are in this figure. And I feel like a lot of things like this arm just feels lumpy and disconnected. I definitely fell down on terms of the pectoral muscles that are underneath the breast and how they should be wrapping into the arm or reaching into the arm, connecting underneath the mass of the shoulder and the deltoid. I really didn't capture that. So let's flatten out that little space between the collarbones so I can wrap this around. And now the challenge here is I'm trying to get a nice lengthy wrap to it, but it's also a little thick the way I'm drawing it. It might be that because I'm drawing more of a profile here, I may have tried to exaggerate and pull the arm out too much. I think that might be one of the things that was really screwing up the drawing, the original drawing, is that maybe, because if you look at this, realistically, the connection, the place where the collarbone meets the scapula, that should be a little bit further in than I have it. And the scapula forms a little bit of a trap with both the upper part, the lower part. Not a trap, a claw. The upper part, the lower part, and the collarbone all basically wrap around, holding the head of the upper arm. The humerus. So let's say that I've got that coming down here. In fact, even looking at this, sometimes I do things just because I want to see how it turns out. So I am curious what happens if I push this a little bit more. And pull this whole connection closer to where the neck is. So it's even more of a profile. So I've got the head inside here a little bit more, and still let it come out so that it's peeking out past the hips, the top of the hips. So I'm kind of playing a little bit of a game here where I'm going back and forth between the bones and the basic conceptual volumes here. Because realistically, I'm not having it overlap well, I am kind of having it overlap the pelvic bone to a certain degree. So what I'm trying to do here now is be conscious of where the major landmarks, the outside of the elbow, where that's landing in relationship, say, the head of the humerus in terms of where it connects with the collarbone, to the elbow, to the wrist. Well, let's say the outside of the ulna, which is the the bone that runs along the bottom, forms the end of the elbow. That bone runs all the way along the outside of the wrist, and then the head of it is here. So let's say that I've got that running all the way down, and let's say that in the original drawing, the palm's kind of resting on her lap. So let's say that maybe that landmark is in here, just sort of over the crotch, and then we've got the hand. And for now, I'll just do a simple, really flattened cube instead of getting deeper into the bones. For now, we'll just do that. So we'll have this running out here. And I think if I really want to pay attention to the direction that that the bones are going, what I should do is properly draw in. Let's say that there's almost like two balls here that make up the bottom of the humerus. And then the ulna is almost like a hook that wraps around it. So if I drew these out separately, so here's the end of the ulna. This part over here, this whole part, is what makes up the elbow per se. There's a little bit of a divot for it to sit in there. Then here's the humerus. So this locks into there, like so. So our little Mr. Bonesy. So here it is, the ulna running all the way down the wrist. And this is the little hook-like area that I was talking about that kind of locks in. This is it from the angle I was drawing it at. You can see it probably a little clearer from the back. But this hinge just sort of clamps on there. Yeah, so I realized that I was drawing this piece almost like it was a profile. And when I try to draw the skeletal, when I'm drawing the bones here, instead of going from the actual figure and the basic volumes that would make up the arms, what I get out of this, the benefit that I find from drawing the bones of this, is that I realize that a lot of times if I'm drawing the skeleton inside incorrectly and the landmarks incorrectly, then I lay the muscles on incorrectly. And you might get it's possible to, let me find something that's squarish. What do I have here that would make a, what do I have that would make a good bone? I mean, a good muscle. I don't have something laying out that makes a good example, so let's just use this per se. So let's say that this is your bicep, and let's say that this is the bone that the bicep is attaching to. Now, if I draw it with the bone facing this way, then I may draw the bicep in subconsciously. I may not understand why I'm doing it, but I may draw the bicep facing out towards the viewer, when if really the bone is angled this way, then the muscle attached to it will be facing more of a profile. And these are little subconscious things that what will happen is a lot of times we may draw the bone in the wrong direction, but the muscle in the correct direction, and then our drawing looks wonky and we don't understand why. So much in the same way that, like, you know, this comes back to kind of, in a way, it's kind of like perspective. When you draw something where you've got a horizon line and you're establishing that front is one way and top is another, but then you draw the elements so that they don't agree with it, you're like, this looks wonky, I don't understand why. Bones and muscles are the same way. If you draw the bones facing the correct direction, but the muscles facing the wrong direction, it may have the basic cylinder, the basic volume that the correct object has, but you'll look at the muscles and the bones, you're like, this looks weird, I don't understand why. So the direction of the landmarks and the direction of the actual muscular anatomy that's on top of it have to agree with each other. And that is where knowledge of both anatomy and perspective really come in handy. Because, you know, the hardest part, and the reason why I'm doing these drawings, is to diagnose things that I did wrong. And I'll tell you, when I'm looking at this drawing now, one of the things I did wrong is I don't think I really identified the landmarks in terms of what's happening with the elbows, with the elbow, and the connection to the humerus. And because of that, the muscles are just sort of like lumped on top of here. Instead of clearly saying the bicep is facing a sort of a 3/4 towards the front. And sometimes it's not necessarily a matter of exaggeration, but sometimes you do have to call out or enhance the fact that you're stating which way the bones are connecting, so that when you connect something else on top of it, they will all agree with each other. Because that disagreement, sometimes the disagreement is out of poor understanding of anatomy. Sometimes that disagreement is simply that you didn't make your statement clear enough. You didn't actually say, no, this is what the body is doing. This is the side of this figure. This is the front of this figure. And sometimes by leaving out details and trying to simplify things, we may leave too much open to interpretation. Now, I think it's a good thing sometimes to let I think it's frequently good to let the viewer do as much of the work as possible. Let the viewer's brain interpret where the bones should be, where the anatomy should be, and just simply understand, like, let their minds fill in all the things that you don't draw. But sometimes, by not drawing those things and not very clearly saying, this is what's happening with this part of the person's body, the human mind may just look at it and say, this doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand what's happening. And so the challenge is knowing when and where to put in anatomical details to clarify what you're trying to say. Instead of just, well, that's the basic volume. They'll figure out the rest. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. And to be honest, one of the reasons why I really value figure drawing and studying figure drawing is because there is no guidebook. There's no rule book to tell you when to let the viewer fill in the details and when you need to tell them this is what it is. The only way you can figure it out is trial and error. You actually have to make the drawing, see it succeed or fail, and then, try it again with putting a little bit more detail or putting a little bit less detail. Because sometimes you put in too much detail and it overwhelms the piece, it's distracting, and people can't figure it out because there's too much going on. You have to try these things. Try and succeed and fail, and then after a certain point you start developing a feel for it, because to a certain degree it is intuitive. It's not a formula. It's something that you have to get a feel for, and no one can tell you how to get a feel for it. You just have to keep doing it and doing it, succeeding and failing. And the idea also, a part of this analysis is, I always say, it's not about me tearing my drawings apart and saying, oh, I'm not a good artist. It's about learning to assess where I've succeeded and where I've failed. The drawing that I do in class is me doing the attempt at observing and crafting a figure around that observation. The process of me analyzing my work after class is me being conscious of where I succeeded and failed, so that when I come back to figure drawing class again and I have a similar pose or a similar thing that I'm attempting to do, that I can say, you know what? These are areas where I need to put more detail. These are areas where I need to put less detail. These are areas where I really need to be conscious of what the front, sides, and backs of both the bones and the muscles are. So I see a few more comments in the chat. Let's see. I see Darnell's in the chat, says, keep doing your thing, boss. I appreciate it, man. I'm going to keep on keeping on. UL says, when do you go from your way versus nature's way? So I'm not sure if I completely understand your question, but I'm going to tell you what I hear, and you tell me if this is what you're saying. So what I hear when you say my way versus nature's way is that you're wondering at what point do you draw what you're observing versus do you draw with anatomical understanding, with ideas, where you impose what you want the drawing to say instead of drawing just what you look at. You can let me know in the comments if that's an accurate translation of what you're asking. And that the answer to that question, I would say that it comes from, well, again, it's a thin line. But the simplest way to answer that is, does it help clarify what you're trying to say? Because when you're drawing the figure, ideally you start with the pose, the gesture of what the figure's doing. Now, even in the phase of just sketching out the rough gesture, you may realize that if you draw exactly what you see, if you're able to replicate it like a photograph, that on paper it still may not look completely realistic, or it may not translate, simply because you're translating a three-dimensional concept to a two-dimensional surface. You're actually putting three-dimensional ideas on paper, and in that process you're flattening it out. So when it comes to changing nature, you're not changing it because, oh, I have this idea and I don't really need to pay attention to anatomy. It's more sort of like you've decided what you want to express about the pose the model's done. Maybe it's accentuating the twist of the torso. Maybe it's getting a nice long line all through the figure, and you maybe want to accentuate the sense of overlap between, because I drew this bone down here, the femur, but there's going to be the lower leg, the tibia and fibia are going to be crossing on top of it, and I'm just lightly drawing them in here. But I start with getting the bone, the part that's underneath first, so that I can draw the next part on top of it and kind of be aware of the relationship between the two. You may want to emphasize this sense of overlap, the sense that there's a torso, that there's an arm overlapping that there's also a leg that's coming out from behind that hand, and that leg is also overlapping the other leg that's on the right hand side. You may be all about clearly communicating the overlap between these forms. You may be about communicating the twist. You may be about communicating the places where bones press against soft flesh. There's a whole lot of things that can go on in a drawing. You may want to try and communicate all of these things at once. And when it comes to clarification, it's almost like being a musical engineer, where you've got a whole bunch of instruments playing, and you have to raise the EQ, the equalizer, on one instrument and lower it on another, because you don't want these things to fight against each other. So the idea, I believe, of you versus nature is, it's almost like in nature we're being bombarded by information constantly. And your job as an artist is to look at that information and decide what is important. Now, these are relative. They are subjective decisions, because different artists will decide that different things are important. Different lighting conditions may dictate that, oh, well, I should enhance this as opposed to that. There is no one overall, this is what's important in a drawing. You come in, you look at the drawing, and you say, all right, what do I want to express, and what do I need to turn up in order to make that expression more visible, and what do I need to turn down? There may be anatomical details where if you draw it exactly as you see it, it may make like there may be a bone that appeared, or there may be a, I don't know, a shadow falling across a figure that actually is falling in a straight line as you see it. But you know that it's wrapping around a curved form. Maybe it's wrapping around the hip as it's curved, let's use this as an example. I'm going to go in, and even though I was still drawing the bones, I'm going to draw in just enough of the hip that we've got a sense of the volume. Now let's say that the way that this figure is lit in a studio, that the lighting may fall in a straight line. You don't want that. What you want is you may decide, all right, what is the surface of the figure doing? If the surface of the figure goes down into the pelvis, then it comes up over the hip and around the leg, you may come in, and that's you making a decision to change what you observe in order to express what you're trying to say about the figure. So, and again, I have to mention my my figure drawing instructor, Carl Ganas. He this is something that he mentioned to me in terms of just the idea of deciding what you want to express and then adapting what you put down on paper, adapting what you observe in order to express those things. And you can find his YouTube channel at Carl GN. I think it's GNASS Studios on YouTube. So he has a YouTube channel as well where he shows a lot of his basics in figure drawing. But that's I think that's the simplest way. And the reason why I understand that your question is a complex one and it's a difficult one, because I currently still continue to struggle with what am I making decisions about versus what am I just drawing bad habits, drawing the way that I've always drawn. So I'm constantly questioning, is what I'm observing helping to express what I want to express? And the hardest part about that is when you are not at the level of draftsmanship that you would like to be, you don't necessarily know if the decisions you're making about, it could be that me trying to express this shoulder being lifted in the bone, maybe that's what the model is really doing. Maybe I'm misobserving it. Maybe I genuinely, the part I put up here does express it enough. Maybe this needs to be pushed up even higher. I still haven't really put in the bottom of the chin. I haven't drawn much of the skull because I think there's so much going on with the figure here that really getting caught up in drawing the skull in itself is as complicated as a whole figure if you're really going to put detail in there. So a lot of times when I'm doing figure drawing, I always feel bad that I never give my models a fair shake when it comes to drawing their heads. They really just get basic volume and then like simple eyes and nose. And some of our models are extremely expressive, but unless we're doing the heads, hands, and feet class, I really don't get very much into drawing the head because, again, it's as complex as drawing a whole figure. But there's all of these little details that I'm constantly saying, all right, is this the right decision or not? And sometimes I'm drawing the figure in class and I will realize I'm able to catch that this is a mistake, I need to fix it, and I'll draw and erase. Sometimes it's way after class, like I haven't put breasts on this figure yet, but the breasts were the things that was bothering me the most in terms of them feeling lopsided and not well laid out on this figure. And part of that is that, like, remember what I mentioned earlier about having the anatomy and the muscles underneath align in terms of perspective? Well, what's happening here in this drawing is that right here where the bottom of the rib cage is and the twist and the breast, these are drawn as though the rib cage is turned both away and at an angle. However, the top of her, the pit of the neck, the top of the rib cage up here is drawn as though it's upright. So there's a disagreement in terms of what the body is doing. Now the rib cage is flexible and it does twist to a certain degree. But I realized that in this drawing, I pulled back the amount of twist that's going there and I still get a nice curve of the rib cage. But there's another version of this drawing that I could do where I experiment and I say, instead of having this being a little bit more upright, I could do a version of this drawing where this level that the bottom of the rib cage is where it's more angled, I can have the upper part as well more angled. And then you makes all of this, the underside of the skull, the angle of the shoulders, all of that could be turned further away. But obviously the way I drew this observationally, I can see enough of the top of the shoulder, the top side of the collarbones, and it feels more of you're viewing from straight on as opposed to viewing it from slightly underneath. That I feel like straightening this out so that the bottom isn't as exaggerated, it feels a little bit more realistic. But again, these are all things that I will do several drawings of the same pose, trying to analyze and understand and figure out what works well in what scenario, what I need to look out for. Because the idea of this is that going back and doing these studies like I'm doing right now is next time that I am drawing a figure in figure drawing class, I can remember the decisions I made, which ones worked, which ones didn't, and I can try solutions in class that will hopefully get me to a good drawing faster. And once I've done this where I feel like I can successfully make decisions about the figure anatomy very quickly, on the fly, in class, that will start to pay dividends when I'm drawing comics. That will start to be... It will affect my comic book drawing in such that I won't be working as hard to draw good figures in comics. What will happen is I will understand enough about anatomy, about volume, about perspective, and about muscles that it no longer becomes, how do I draw this figure? It simply becomes, what is the story I'm trying to tell? And the closer I can get to being focused purely on story, the better I can tell visual stories. I can focus more on the compositional elements, the narrative elements. Does this express what I want a scene to express? A lot of times I have felt, and I still continue to feel, that my struggles to improve my anatomy on the page when I'm drawing a comic book, those slow down my my actual comic book storytelling. I feel like they get in the way in the sense that I can't draw exactly what I see in my head. And again, that's a good reason for taking reference photos and having reference. So you don't have to pull everything from your head. You can look at your reference photos and you can treat them the same way as a figure that you're drawing in a figure drawing class. Where you're making decisions and you're saying, does this angle help describe what I'm trying to say? And it again all comes down to expression, what you're trying to say with your drawing. So I'm not going to wrap this up quite yet. We've still got maybe another 10 minutes here, but I notice we're at 11:50, so we're not quite at an hour. But while I'm working on this skeleton a little bit more, if you guys have any last minute questions, now's probably a good time to ask them, because I will be wrapping up the live stream in about 10 minutes or so. Now right here, even this is a questionable area. I've just sort of like put in a basic volume here representing the tibia, which is the main bone, but I haven't really addressed the fibula, which is the leg bone that's on the outside. So, when you usually see that large bone, the shin bone, which you're looking at the tibia, but I haven't really addressed the fibula and how it ties in with that volume. I feel like even though I put a rounding here to give the sense of the leg resting, the sense of the lower part of the foot resting on the leg, that I probably need to get in here and put in some of the bone structure a little bit more. And it might be that this doesn't cut across as high. It might be that this cuts a little bit lower, and it may more be that it rests flat, and then the flesh around may just drop off as the leg kind of turns away, as it rounds down, as it becomes its more cylindrical form. Let's see here. So a few more questions in the chat. Yuel asks, do you try pen forces you to make marks faster, but more choice marks? And then Mark asks, I'm studying product sketching. What books would you buy? So the book on product sketching is probably easier to answer because, well, it's a book that I don't know if it's in print anymore. And if it's still in print, I've seen it in Amazon and it's very expensive. So I feel bad recommending it. I happened to order it when they did a new printing. It's a book called Rapid Viz. Let me see if I can find it in my book library. So I'm answering this first only because Yuel's answer is a little bit longer and I actually have some samples to show talking about that. Okay, so Mark, this book is called Rapid Viz. It's the 3rd edition, and it says a new method for rapid visualization of ideas. And this book is basically by some old school product and concept designers. So this is almost like it's a precursor to doing concept development, but for product design. And it's Kurt Hanks and Larry Belliston. And I can't remember what class I took where I learned about this book. But the idea of it was really just learning how to very simplify basic volumes, structures, ideas. This book does get into perspective in a very basic sense. This copy is actually falling apart a little bit. Some of the pages are falling out because I've been using it for so many years. So it's got the key principles of perspective. The whole beginning thing is just learning how to draw boxes and spheres in perspective, because once you can do that, you can use it to build any form. And what they do, this book walks you through learning how to build increasingly complex forms, volumes, drawing ellipses in perspective. In fact, this is another really good book on perspective. I'll include that to the list. And then once it walks you through combining these forms, it's showing you that the whole world really is made up of primitive shapes and concepts. And then once you learn how to do that, then it starts giving you exercises of actually doing illustrations of these complex ideas. So this book, I would say, is excellent on that. You know what? I can't believe I didn't think of it yet. Well, this one gets more into environments and forms as well. Once you get past basic perspective, this is all really about objects. It's not really about figure drawing per se. But this book is also out of print last I checked. So I found copies online, and I think I paid $20 for this book when I got it. And the last time I saw it online, it was for like $80. So I don't know if they've done a new printing of this book, but I'll see if I can find it. And if I can find a version that's reasonably priced, I'll put that in the links in the description of the video. Now, I'm talking about all of this, and I can't believe I didn't mention Scott Robertson. Now, I think I didn't mention Scott Robertson because I still haven't gone through this book and drawn everything yet. But this one is the same concept, but for a modern day drawing and illustration. Scott Robertson's been teaching at Art Center for many years. And this book gets deep into perspective, basic volumes. This is almost like it's a more complicated and more challenging version of the Rapid Viz book. it gets into all of the same concepts and it has exercises for you. It walks you through. There's a lot of perspective in this book. It's a great book, and it shows you how to draw much more complex things. I think it's a little bit... This book can be a little bit daunting because of how... he doesn't sugarcoat it. He puts in some really complex, challenging drawing ideas in here, but he starts you, again, with just the basics of cubes and cylinders and shows you how to draw increasingly complex things. But this book actually gets much more, I think, into product design and product sketching and physical concept sketching. I think this is sort of like the advanced version of the Rapid Viz book. So, but I also think it's not necessarily even that it's more advanced. I think the Rapid Viz book, the first edition, I think came out in like the 70s or 80s, and the edition I have was like maybe the 90s or early 2000s. And I think that, honestly, a lot of art students today come in with, they've been drawing since they were younger, they've had more access to perspective and concept and tutorials and like all of that art information that was harder to come by in earlier years. I think a lot of kids have access to those things now. Like if you're a student going to art center, they expect you to come in with a certain level of understanding of the fundamentals already. So this book is for a lot of people who have already maybe watched tutorials online, taken classes, and they've already read some books on it. This one is sort of like, this is for kicking up your A game to like professional level. By the time you're done with this, you'll have, this book has the knowledge that professional product sketching, concept design artists have in it. I have not bought the book myself, but Peter Hand has a book called Dynamic Sketching, which I think also covers a lot of these concepts. Comes highly recommended. I've looked at it. I think it's a great book. I just don't own it yet. But that one I think also should get some honorable mention. Let's see here. I see Iron Rocks in the chat says, I just assume I'm always here since you called out first in the chat. Well, I do assume you're always here. I didn't, so I'm sorry if I missed you there lurking. So yeah, Mark says, yeah, add that to the list, and he's definitely gonna buy it. Some of these books are pricey. Like I think the Scott Robertson book it's a $40 book. I'm sure it's cheaper on Amazon, but I'll put links to everything that I mentioned on this video. Now, I want to go back to UL's question, because that one I think will take a little bit longer to show you. Not super long, but in terms of drawing with pen, in order to make more direct decisions, forcing you to commit to a drawing. I've been doing a series of sketches, and I haven't really been posting those online. Maybe I'll post all of them on my Patreon so you guys can see all of them. But I do a lot of sketching. I've been trying to get better at sketching with the Pentel Aqua brush that I've shown. And what these are is I've been doing a series of studies of Michelangelo drawings. I have a book. Okay, that book is not in my studio now because I think I was in the living room drawing with it. But I have a book that's a collection of drawings by Michelangelo. And so I've been doing studies of Michelangelo figure drawings that he's done either studies for his frescoes or for his sculptures. And so I was doing these drawings, and I was doing them with the brush pen, both for practice, but also because, like you said, it does force you to commit to drawings, and sometimes you make bad drawings, sometimes you make good drawings. And that's probably another reason why I haven't shared all of these. It's because a lot of these are pretty crappy drawings. But me just trying to learn how to get better at rendering different forms and volumes and rendering anatomy with a tool that makes such direct marks. Like on this one, I may have gotten the proportion of the figure correctly, but in terms of actually describing the volumes, a lot of this is kind of a mess. And me, like some of the sketches I have in here is me trying to understand ways when I'm using heavy pen and ink to describe muscles overlapping, interlocking with each other. These are all, just challenging elements, and me trying to figure out how to get primitive forms, trying to describe, muscles and volumes either coming forward in space and back. Like in this lower leg, I feel like I got the lower leg receding by giving these kind of curved lines on the lower side, but I don't feel like I got the sense of the upper thigh coming forward. Again, these are more of them, and I've got little notations of which tips and which ink I've been using. And this one is kind of like just really more of a flat figure. This one doesn't have too much of the volumes going in and out. But the ink that, the question that you all mentioned of drawing an ink to force you to commit, this very much makes me commit to the light side, the light is coming from the left, the shadow side is on the right, and it allows me to, like when I discussed describing basic primitive forms, it gives you a sense of this is a side plane, this is a front plane. So it helps you more define those planes. And I think one of the reasons why I found it interesting to do studies from Michelangelo because of that is because Michelangelo is notorious in a good way for having muscle masses weaving in and out of each other. He can make the overall figure have a front and a side and a bottom or top, and yet there's so much detail and so many forms moving in and out that as a viewer you have a hard time. Well, as a viewer, you he very masterfully delineates which parts of the form are moving in and out, what's in front of and behind another form. You know, when he's painting, when he's drawing, he gives you that sense of making it feel like a sculpture. But as a student trying to duplicate his drawings, when you try to duplicate it, it just comes out like a bunch of mush and marbles. So for me, I felt like it was a good practice for me to experiment working from Michelangelo and trying to define both major planes and then have elements within those planes moving in and out of each other, overlapping, interlocking. So that's what all of these sketches have been. So drawing with a pen, this is one of the Michelangelo drawings that I was studying from. Drawing with a pen is very useful for that kind of direct sketching. And I think it's a good idea to try a variety of that. I could do the same types of studies in charcoal pencil, like I'm studying my own figure drawings. But I found that with this has the exact opposite problem. Or not problem, but challenge. You don't have to commit to a particular angle or form or volume. You can continue to massage the drawing over and over again, adjusting, tweaking. I'm gonna get rid of this shadow here because that was just for the sake of explaining light moving across the form. I don't really need that shadow there. I don't want that shadow there because I want to draw the bone underneath. Oh, Mark says that he owns Peter Hahn's books, paid $60 for it signed. That sounds like a good deal. Yeah, one of my former coworkers had a copy of Dynamic Sketching, was letting me look through it, and it's like, you just want to drool all over that book. His work is beautiful, and he explains a lot of his concepts about structure and physical dynamics, making something that feels both solid and dynamic at the same time. Like, his books are so great at showing that. And it's a shame that I don't own any of his books. One of the reasons there's only one reason why I don't own any of his books, and that's because I've mentioned this in one of my old YouTube videos a long time ago called Reference Rot, which is I have fallen into the habit of buying so many art books because I feel like, oh, this is information that I want to learn. I want to get better at this. I'm going to buy a book on it. Now, that's great. Buying a book and then never opening it and having it just sit on your bookshelf, that's horrible. So at this point, I have dozens upon dozens. I could easily say I probably have 40 odd instructional art books that I have never really opened and studied from with any serious degree. Now, that's not 40 art books that I own. I probably own like anywhere from like 80 to 80, I probably own double that. I probably own like 80 different instructional art books that teach some aspect, whether it's perspective, anatomy, storytelling, lighting, some books that are maybe about filmmaking. So like I have the, what's it called? Shot by Shot by I believe it's Michael Katz. And that's a filmmaking book, but it's about like blocking and storytelling. And there's a sequel called Cinematic Motion. You know, those are books that are about filmmaking, but they're about visual storytelling, and that's why I got them for comics. The point being is that I have many, many books. I own many, many books that are educational, and I've only probably really sat down and studied maybe half of them. So that's something that I don't want to keep buying books and thinking that, oh, I'm going to get better just because I buy the books. What I need to do is actually sit down and study with them, which this is actually a good time to bring up something that I'm starting in October. And I've mentioned this in the past, but I'm going to start what I call the art book study group. And I'm going to start with Walt Reed's The Figure, and I'm going to sit down and I'm going to use my my Patreon exclusive live streams to sit down with this book, and I'm going to start at page 1, and you know, maybe on page 1 there isn't anything to draw from, but I'm going to go through, and each time I get to a page that has something to draw from, I'm going to do a study from that page, and I may do a study of all of the sketches on that page until I feel like I understand what that particular section of the book has to offer. Now, in an hour's time, it may take me 3 sessions to get through one page. I may get through 5 pages in one session of sketching. I don't know. We're going to try it out. It's going to be an experiment. We'll see how it goes. But the idea is going to be that I'm going to actually sit down and show you. It's not me giving you a tutorial. I'm going to show you how I study from art books and what I take away from it. So I'm going to show you my process of learning what's in this book. And once I finish this book, we'll move on to another book. So that's going to be a Patreon exclusive, and that's when I'm going to start using my exclusive videos for starting in October. So if you're not currently on the Patreon, you can sign up for as little as $2 a month. It gives you access to additional bonus. Well, you'll get access to the drawing club. You'll also be able to read Morning Star as I'm posting it on my Patreon well in advance of me posting it on the news page. So you can read it as a webcomic there. And you'll also get 2 extra blog posts per week where I'm sharing either figure drawings or works in progress from Morningstar. So, okay. I still have to go through and work out a little bit more of the anatomy in the hips. But as you can see here, if you compare the sense of anatomy sitting on a sloppy framework, it's got all of the muscles and bones, but they're lumpy, they're not particularly in the right place. I have not even gotten to the point of actually adding musculature to this figure yet, but I already feel a lot more confident about this figure just by virtue of working out the skeletal details that I've worked out here. So this drawing still requires more. I have to work out the knees. I have to work out drawing the connection between the leg and this hip, which is hidden back here. And honestly, the hidden parts are the most challenging parts. But I have to work out the connection of the pelvis on the far side, making sure that I get that and how that transforms and flows into the upper leg, the femur, getting that transition there. Having the hand that's sitting on the leg wrapping over these forms. Having this leg resting on top of the leg and then having this bone coming down there. So these are all things that this drawing still needs to address. But there will be things for me to work on at another time because we've reached the end of our time for this week. So, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Let me raise the camera up slightly so you guys can, there we go. So, as I mentioned before, we'll be starting the art book study group next month. You can subscribe for that at patreon.com/Ernest. morningstar.com/GERIMI. You can read pages of Morningstar on my newsletter archive, and it's news.jeremy.net. And of course, as I mentioned before, physical copies of my books. Also, if you read digitally on Amazon Kindle, you can go to amazon.jeremy.net. That's my Amazon page. So thank you everybody for the great comments in the chat and the great questions. Thank you for spending time. I hope this was useful to you. And you know what? Please hit that share button. Share it with other people. Share it on Facebook. Share it on Twitter. If there's other artists you know that you think would get something out of my my live streams, please share it with them. I really appreciate that. So for now, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your weekend and go be creative.